Yes, good morning. I think it's morning for you. It is for me. Uh, First of all, I'd like to say that I'm still having problems with my throat, and I've got a whole bottle of water this time, and I've also brought a little peppermint flavored little teeny candy like you see in the restaurant. So when I start having problems, don't be surprised. It's a terrible affliction, but with all the dust in our world that seems to be coming from all over, well, it's coming from Africa, which by the way is a very interesting thing if you think about it, because you're thinking Sahara Desert, you're thinking about the Israelites in Egypt, you're thinking about all that. It is a pretty unusual thing to think that we are still doing stuff that's been going over a couple of thousand years. Isn't that amazing? Or is it that God is amazing? I think it's the latter. Anyway, today, so we're going to continue with Nehemiah, which is a very unusual character. He's one of those kind of guys that if he was your boss and you did something and it went up the chain to go up to the higher ups, your name would be in that report. He's not the kind of guy that his name would be in the report. I love people like that because you see them as people who are trying to do the right thing, and he is constantly praying to God to try and do the right thing. And I think he wants a little bit of help and a little bit of leadership from God to make sure he is on that right path. I know I need all the pathways I can find. So we're going to start off with a date, of course. In 701 BC, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, overcame some cities in Judah. But he did not overcome Jerusalem because God didn't let him. The Assyrians became weak, and here comes the Babylonians who took control of their country, Assyria. The king of the Babylonians was Nebuchadnezzar. The Babylonian army overcame Judah. The soldiers took most of the Jews to Babylonia and forced them to live there. This is called the Babylonian exile. It lasted for about 70 years, and we probably said that for the last 4 or 5 weeks. Nebuchadnezzar did not honor the real God. Instead, Nebuchadnezzar was serving false gods. But God still used Nebuchadnezzar to punish the Jews. God also said that he would punish the Babylonians in 70 years because they were wicked too. God is in control. He even uses people who do not even know him. After many years, the Persians defeated the Babylonians. Then Cyrus, the king of Persia, allowed the Jews to return home to Judah. The book of Ezra is the first part. It tells us about the groups of Jews who returned to Judah. The first group returned about 70 years after the Babylonians had taken the Jews into exile. The book also explains how the Jews built their temple again. Many years later, a man called Ezra helped the Jews. He helped them to know God's commands and to obey them. They had forgotten how to worship God. The book of Nehemiah is the second part. It tells the story of a man whose name was Nehemiah, who worked for the king of Persia. God sent Nehemiah to Judah in order to do a special task. Nehemiah would help the Jews to build the walls around Jerusalem again. He arrived in Judah about 13 years after Ezra went there. The king appointed Nehemiah to be the ruler of Judah. Now let's stop and talk for a few minutes about walls, just a little review. Now in ancient times, most cities had city walls. The walls would be strong and high and thick. The top of the wall would be flat. The city guards would walk on top of the wall. They could watch for any criminals who were inside the city. Also, the guards would be able to see if an enemy was approaching. There would be some towers along the wall. They were tall, strong buildings that the guards could use, and they would be very useful if there was a war. The wall would have large gates. During the day, these gates were open. Traders and travelers could enter into the city. But by night, the guards closed the gates, and the city would be safe. Because the wall was so strong, people would use it for other purposes. An example, people might build their houses against it. In some cities, the houses actually became part of the city wall. So the wall became a row of houses. Half a century after the city's fall, Cyrus of Persia encouraged the exiles to return to their city and rebuild it and its temple. The city was no longer the capital of a nation state with a Davidic king. It now served as the center of the relatively autonomous Persian province of Judah, which belonged to a greater network of 20 provinces. This Jewish community was administered by the temple priesthood under the supervision of a Persian appointed governor. Persia encouraged strong local economies extending from India in the east to Turkey in the north to Egypt in the southwest. The empire was dependent upon the taxation of produce and goods. You might be reminded that the Assyrians and the Babylonians, of course, removed the people, took them to an entirely different country so they could not be worried about a revolt. Whereas in this case, here you go with the nice guy, or maybe a nice guy, in which Cyrus is sending people back home where they would be happier and, hate to tell you, but think taxation and everybody's happy and more willing to pay. Centuries later, some even dared to envision the holy city of the New Jerusalem descending from heaven, in which the reign of God and his Messiah would be among all people, and the security and wholeness that was found within the city would reach to the furthest ends of the earth. Revelation 21. You might want to look that up, because when you get into the 20s, chapters 20s, it gets real going strong in Revelation. Now, our first reading today is chapter 4, verses 1 through 9. When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, "What are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are?" Tobiah and the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, "What are they building? Even a fox climbing up on it would break down their walls of stone. Hear us, our God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders." So we built the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their heart. But when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod heard that the repairs to Jerusalem's walls had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, they were very angry. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. But we prayed to our God and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. Now, you noticed in chapter 4, those first 3 verses, Sanballat and Tobiah were the enemies of the Jews. They did not want the Jews to build the walls of the Jerusalem again. Jerusalem would become an important city for trade. Again, they would lose some of their trade. And we know that, remember, rule number 1, it's all about money. These men were opposing God's work, God's plan that the Jews should live in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the country that God promised to give to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Jews had to leave the country because of sin, but God promised by the prophets that some Jews would return. So it was God's plan that the Jews would rebuild Jerusalem. God's plan did not only benefit the Jews, God had decided by means of the Jews to help people from every nation. A little fortune telling here. He would send Jesus to be born a Jew. God had promised this by the prophets. And Jesus would die for their sins from every nation. God would forgive all people who invite Jesus into their lives. Nehemiah was doing God's work, and it was not just men who were opposing the work. The devil was using these men because the devil wanted to oppose God's work. Sanballat had the army from the country called Samaria with him. By the way, don't forget, the army that Cyrus had, he sent some of his folks to go along with Nehemiah. So there was a little bit of protection there. Sanballat had the army from the country called Samaria with him. But Sanballat and Tobiah did not attack the Jews. They could not do that because the king had allowed Nehemiah to build the walls. Sanballat and Tobiah hoped that they could upset the Jews. Then the Jews might stop the construction of the wall. Sanballat and Tobiah said that the task was too great. The builders were too weak. The wall would fall down easily. But God did help them. When the Jews finished the work, the walls were very strong. The people marched on top of the walls. Nehemiah started his report at the sheep gate. He divided the work between many people, and each had their own part to repair. Nehemiah's report goes all around the wall and back to the sheep's gate. Very organized person. You might remember that some of those gaps were because the gates had not been installed. So Nehemiah prayed. Perhaps he called the people together to pray. He says us in his prayer. Hear us, our God, for we are despised. The Jews did not take notice of the insults of their enemies, and they continued to build, and the wall reached half of its final height. Today, we do not pray that our enemies will suffer. Jesus taught us to forgive our enemies, and we should pray that they will trust Jesus. Previously, God had told the Jews to oppose their enemies. See Deuteronomy chapter 7. God was using the Jews for his purposes. These enemies had become so evil that they could not avoid a terrible punishment. And God gave the land to the Jews. Nehemiah did not actually try to fight his enemy. Instead, he trusted God. Nehemiah was confident that he was doing God's work. So Nehemiah asked God to defend his or God's own work. And so Nehemiah asked God to oppose these enemies. Now in verses 7 through 9, you notice that the enemies of the Jews heard that their insults had not succeeded, and the wall had reached half of its final height. So Sanballat and his friends were very angry. They needed another plan. These enemies lived all around Jerusalem. They plotted to fight against the city. Nehemiah and his people did the sensible thing again. They prayed to God, and they also guarded the city. Now our second reading is Nehemiah 5, verses 1 through 5. Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their fellow Jews. Some were saying, "We and our sons and daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain." Others were saying, "We are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during the famine." Still others were saying, "We have had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. Although we are of the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews, and though our children are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others." They had no money to buy things and pay their taxes, so they were forced to mortgage their land and houses, sell their children into slavery to raise needed funds. Verse 3 noted that a famine was also affecting the welfare of the people. The mention of the laborers' wives participating in public protest is a strong indication that the entire community was in crisis. Nehemiah knew that the people would have to make sacrifices in order to complete this enormous building project in a short period of time. However, he never dreamed that some of the wealthier Jews would take advantage of the workers who were now in difficult financial straits. So he called a public meeting to discuss this crisis. He rebuked those who were profiting off the workers and asked them to return any houses and lands that had been taken and to refund interest that had been paid. He admitted that he, his brothers, and his men had also been loaning money at interest, but he wanted this practice to stop immediately. Let us stop charging interest. He made the lenders take an oath before the priests that they would not do this again, and he pronounced a curse on anyone who violated his instructions. There were no further complaints. You might be interested to note that while I was looking at this stuff, I came across a place where some people were charging 75% interest, which really caught my attention. Chapter 5 ends with Nehemiah's account of his own personal practice with regard to governing the people. He never sought to profit off the people. His position as governor entitled him to receive payment and land from the citizens' taxes, and he never asked for it. Instead, he devoted himself entirely to the work of the wall. He was a leader who knew how to lead. Our next reading is Nehemiah 6, chapter 6, verses 14 through 16. Remember Tobiah and Sanballat, my God, because of what they have done. Remember also the prophets, Noadiah, and how she and the rest of the prophets have been trying to intimidate me. So the wall was completed on the 25th of Elul in 52 days. Elul, by the way, is the month that we heard last week in which they started using the months. When all of our enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God. Nehemiah was faced with two serious threats. First was an invitation from the coalition led by Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, the Arab, to meet for a discussion in a town away from Jerusalem. Nehemiah knew that the real intent was to do him harm, so he rejected this offer 4 times. The 5th time, they sent a letter accusing Nehemiah of rebellion against the Persian king. They claimed he had set himself up as the king of Jerusalem by appointing prophets to confirm his status. Nehemiah responded by accusing his enemies of lying. The second threat also came from the coalition. They hired a prophet in Jerusalem named Shemaiah, who claimed some men were plotting to assassinate Nehemiah, and his only escape was to hide in the temple. Nehemiah refused to believe him, recognizing that Shemaiah was a false prophet trying to damage his reputation. The Mosaic law stated only priests could enter the temple, and Nehemiah was not a priest. So he brushed off Shemaiah's enticement to sin. Apparently, there were a number of prophets in Jerusalem who were influenced by Tobiah and some Sanballat to oppose Nehemiah. The prophet Noadiah was one of them. Her mention here is probably an indication that she was especially troublesome. Nehemiah asked God to judge these prophets as well as their sponsors for the intimidation and harassment that they were bringing against him. The completion of the wall here is one of the highlights of the book. On the 25th of Elul, the 6th month, approximately 5 months after Nehemiah had left Persia, the fact that it was completed in 52 days is a testimony to the leadership skills of Nehemiah. It also indicates that the wall was not of the same quality as the walls of Solomon, Hezekiah, and Herod. One could almost describe Nehemiah's wall as a do-it-yourselfer's project when compared to the professionally built walls of the kings in Jerusalem's history. However, Nehemiah was not making any comparisons. He was simply grateful and relieved that God had enabled him to finish this much-needed project in spite of mocking, threats of attack, accusations, assassination plots, criticism from his own people. This gifted leader was certainly God's person for this job. Nehemiah had to continually maintain military readiness against the possibility of a surprise attack. Jerusalem was now, for all intents and purposes, a secure city. Everyone recognized that it had only been achieved with the help of our God. Yahweh truly wanted his people to prosper, and this thought brought fear to Judah's neighbors. Let us close with a word of prayer, please. Heavenly Father, our blessings are upon you. Thank you, thank you. We would ask for your help with this global plague, but we would also thank you for the rebuilding of this wall in Jerusalem in the times that would come that follow later. Yes, they would build another new wall, and it would be an excellent quality. But yes, God, this solved a huge problem at this time. Jerusalem was back. The city was walled in, and people were fearful of you, our Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.